Good evening. This is the Challenge of Faith with Adrian Roberts, and it's the 5th of February 2017. Now, the two readings I want to look at this evening are, on the one hand, Isaiah chapter 58 verses 1 to 9 and Matthew's Gospel chapter 5 verses 13 to 20. First of all, the Isaiah. Well, here we have a fairly familiar contrast between, on the one hand, people who seem to think that you get right with God, that you achieve righteousness, as it were, by doing things like fasting, covering your head with sackcloth and ashes, and generally undergoing all sorts of peculiar religious rituals. Whereas Isaiah points out that the way to really make it right with God, to get it right with God, to be a light noticed by God, as it were, is to loose the yoke of injustice, to share your bread with the hungry, to cover the naked, to invite the poor into your home. Now, you might think that this is an obvious contrast, that it's obviously going to be more right with God, with reality, with doing the right thing, to be generous, to be concerned for justice rather than concerned for ritual and rather obsessive practices that you might otherwise engage in. But presumably there were times, and perhaps there have always been times and places, where people have thought that actually these rituals are preferable, and they're certainly in a way a lot easier. But it was also prophets like Isaiah who made it clear that this contrast was to be affirmed, that the right way to be right with God was not through doing rituals, but actually through being righteous, being just, being concerned for the poor, being concerned for justice. We first heard it in the prophet Isaiah and in other prophets too. I don't think there's much older than that where you get quite this same sort of contrast. And also, even though it's something that we take for granted and might see as obvious, it is something that is extremely challenging. It's probably, one could say, what lies at the heart of what is good about Marxism. The dependence of Karl Marx on the Old Testament is an area that's perhaps under-acknowledged, but I think it's there. You might say all that is good about what he taught can be found in the Bible, though perhaps that's a bit of a challenge. But it is very, very difficult. Just consider for a moment what your life would be like if you consistently put into practice what Isaiah is asking you to do. The enormously disruptive effects of sharing to a self-sacrificial level, to inviting the poor into a home that you may feel is small enough already, to allow the disruptive effects of this to take over your life. Very few people are able to achieve this. And yet Isaiah is clear that that kind of thing is what God expects. And when we come to Matthew's Gospel, the situation is equally challenging, if not more so. Jesus is proclaiming that the righteousness of his followers must exceed that of those close followers of the Jewish Torah, the scribes and the Pharisees. And he proclaims that their law will not pass away, that every bit of it will still stand, which has caused some surprise to commentators until you realise that after verse 20 he then outlines what he means by that law, and he recasts it in a way that is even more challenging than the way followed by the scribes and the Pharisees. So what are we to make of this? Are we just to despair or to throw ourselves on God's mercy and say we are sinners, we can't do better than we do, even though it's very little? Well, I think it's perfectly true that we are, and we do need to throw ourselves on God's mercy, and that really lies at the heart of the Christian gospel, that we don't save ourselves, we are saved. Salvation comes as a gift. The counsel of perfection that we are told to follow is one that we cannot follow with any consistent success. But I think there is a note of hope and possibility in some of the things Jesus says in this passage, and I want to target particularly where he says that we can be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Now, the thing about both salt and light is you don't need very much of them to make a difference. A very little salt can act as a preservative, and a very little salt can flavour a dish. How much light do you need to conquer the darkness? One small light, not very much. The darkness is conquered even by the presence of that tiny light. And we may look at the world around us, a world very often of darkness and a world of tedious tastelessness, and ask ourselves, how can we change it? How can we achieve a difference? How can we actually make ourselves part of this righteousness? It is so difficult to make a significant difference to the world around us. But what I want to suggest is if we actually regard ourselves as trying to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, every tiny little effort that we make may have a difference far beyond what we anticipate. It would perhaps be arrogant to suppose that we could do more. Being salt, we are doing what appears to be a tiny thing, a few grains here and there. But the difference it makes is incalculable. Being a light, one small candle, how important is that? Very little, you may think. But that one small light can make a difference far beyond what we anticipate. And so if we can perhaps try to put into practice, even in a small way, even taking faltering steps towards these hugely challenging demands that are made on us in both these passages, we will in fact be starting to respond to Jesus' command that we should be the salt of the earth, which may be small but must not lose its savour, and the light of the world, which may be a flickering small light, but let us not put out our own lights, let us keep them burning, small as they are. And then our Father in heaven will see our good works. Well, we're not doing them to be praised, we're not doing them to be rewarded, but we are doing them to have a good effect. And the noticing by the Father in heaven that Jesus refers to is saying that these actions will make a difference, that God will see them and they will all be part of his saving plan. And this may seem a rather grandiloquent way of talking about one tiny little act of kindness, one tiny little concern for justice, one tiny little piece of generosity. But I think these tiny little acts may well have effects far beyond what we can conceive, and that therefore we should with hope strive to continue to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, because the effect that it may have may be far more than we can conceive or anticipate. And I wish you all a very good and blessed evening, and we will return to the Sermon on the Mount, those very challenging teachings of Jesus, next week. Good night.